Tuesday Drive.
Now, I'd like to read you something, if I may. Australian Jewish refugee Simcha Gazman thought his wife and children were safe when he left them in Poland. The 26-year-old arrived in Australia in 1939, hoping to establish himself with a job and a home before sending for his family to join him. Now, in 1943, he managed to send them a food parcel with the help of a Jewish humanitarian agency from Portugal. But by that time, his young family had already been murdered by Nazis in Auschwitz. His children were 4 and 6 years old. This sad story is just one of many that my next guest, Dr. Yan Lanseck, an academic from the University of New South Wales, will be uncovering from the State Library of New South Wales archives. And he joins me now. Welcome to Tuesday Drive.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, why are you looking at revealing these stories, Jan?
Well, I think it is a good opportunity now, or 75 years after the end of the war, to think again about the role of Australia and Australian society in the Holocaust, in the sense of that Australia was also part of the story. And if we take a look at these stories of refugees or migrants who managed to escape from Europe before the war, and they reached Australia, they saved themselves. But what we often tend to forget is that they often left their family members behind. The Gazman story is the most shocking in them because he left without his wife and children. But if you think about all these almost 10,000 Jewish refugees who came before the war, every single one of them left somebody behind. And most of them did not survive the war. They perished in the camps or were murdered in different ways. So it shows that there were people in Australia during the war for whom the Holocaust was a very personal story. And until today, nobody has really focused on these people. And I think that we can bring them back to history and show these connections between Australia and the Holocaust.
Do you think there's a chance that younger generations are, possibly losing touch with the Holocaust? Like they might not be aware of what lies within their family history here in Australia?
Well, I think so. I think that it is still, as an academic, it is still a popular subject. Kids like to take it. Kids like to learn about that. But with survivors leaving us now, and we are possibly in the last years now when we can personally talk to survivors, people in 5-10 years won't have this opportunity. So I, as a scholar, as an educator, have been thinking about what we can do possibly to make it still relevant for younger kids, but also maybe to relate it to our current world where there are so many refugees or migrants who come to Australia recently, in recent years and decades, and they are in a similar situation because also their family members often are left behind. Nowadays it's easy to stay in contact, much easier than before, but they are also in some cases in countries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, where they can still suffer under not really democratic regimes. And so we have people here in Australia whose relatives, close friends, are still subject to such suffering in other countries. So it makes it also part of our society, I believe.
So you obviously you're uncovering these stories from the state archives. Are you encouraging people to come forward and share their stories with you as well?
Definitely. I mean, one of the biggest problems with this particular project is that there must be so much still in families that people, maybe they don't know about it, maybe they just don't want to separate from correspondence, from family stories, or maybe, and that's often the case of us historians, that people don't think it's interesting. But it is incredibly interesting and important to have these stories recorded. And so if anybody, of course, has any story and would like to share it, I'm really keen on learning about it because it is an important part of our history.
Now, if there is somebody who remembers the Holocaust, or perhaps they have a family member that experienced the atrocity of the Holocaust, how can they get in contact with you, Jan?
Well, I mean, the easiest way is the UNSW, University of New South Wales website, and there are all the contact details there. So that might be the easiest way. I don't know if your radio can share contact details, or if you can refer to the story that was published recently about our research.
No, we can certainly do that because, as like you said, there won't be many people left to share their stories soon.
No, unfortunately not. Even now. I mean, most of the survivors we can talk to in person are in their 90s, and they were small kids during the war. So it's becoming very difficult.
It seems that our country has quite a connection with the Holocaust. Why do you think that many Australians may not know about this part of our history where we appear to welcome so many refugees?
I mean, I think one of the reasons why this, in my opinion, is the case is that the Holocaust is still commemorated or thought about as something that just happened in Europe. And of course it did happen in Europe, but we are not really looking for these connections to our society. And that is possibly my kind of explanation for that. That even if you go to some of the main museums in Australia that offer Holocaust exhibition, it is very much talked about as a European story. But we have so many similar cases of Gazman that you mentioned at the beginning, which show that actually it was also Australian story in the sense of people who came here before the war and who kind of... I remember once that I talked to one professor, and he mentioned that his father was Australian born, but his mother came from Europe. And that they have completely different experiences from the Second World War, that his father was all about the Pacific, the war with the Japanese. His mother was much more concerned about Europe because her family was in Europe. So it shows that even at that time, people had different memories of the Second World War because of their personal and family connections.
Do you know how many refugees we did welcome in Australia?
I think that... something which we probably should talk more about is that it was, although in absolute numbers, it was not the highest number, but proportionately, it was one of the most generous kind of policies. About 10,000 came before the Second World War, Jewish refugees, and even a higher number came after the war as survivors of the Holocaust. And that was possibly the second highest number after the war, after the state of Israel, which has completely different, obviously, connection to the Jewish community. So it was fairly generous policy at the time.
Now, yeah, I don't have much long left, unfortunately, but I mean, throughout history, when we went to school, of course, we've learned that, that millions of Jews were exterminated, and I can only imagine that you've come across some really gut-wrenching stories. What lessons do you think that we can learn from that in 2020?
It's really tough. I mean, we can see even recently that there's increasing anti-Semitism all over the world, including this country. It's not as serious here, and I think that we should be glad for that. But sometimes we feel like that we will never properly learn. One of the main slogans of the Holocaust was "never again," and still it's being said. But we know that since the end of the Second World War, there are many cases of a fairly similar violence, including Europe in the 1990s, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia. So all we can do is to educate young people about it and spread the message and the hope that it will help.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's been a somber but important conversation, and I wish you well with this such important work.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. That was Dr. Jan Lanicek, an academic from the University of New South Wales, looking at the Holocaust through the lens of Australian Jewish refugees. And as we just mentioned there, if you know someone who is a Holocaust survivor, or perhaps you have a family member that may have passed, but you know the story, then you can get in contact with Dr. Lanicek via the University of New South Wales website, and we will put contact details up there as well to make it easy for you.
This is Tuesday Drive.